right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Glad that everybody's here. We've had a great response rate for this, and we're excited to share a couple things with you today over the next 2 hours that we think will be a great um, resource to your communities and to your projects. And if you are not familiar with what we've been doing in South Carolina Brownfields, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview, make some introductions for some folks that are on the line, and then let them take over and run the webinar from here. So I am Tyler Lewis with Catawba Regional Council of Governments out of Rock Hill, South Carolina. And we have had the extreme pleasure of partnering with South Carolina DHEC for Brownfields redevelopment and the fund management of the state's RLF for the past 15 years. From that, many cool projects have happened. Many sites have been revitalized across the state, and most recently, there has been a statewide assessment effort, the South Carolina Brownfields Environmental Site Testing Program, SCBEST for short, that has been going on for the past 18 months. And from that, we have been around the state. Catawba Regional Services is the manager for that program, partnering with the other COGs throughout the state to identify sites for environmental testing. And what we found is that a lot of places, rural communities, have properties that are ready to go to the next stage of cleanup, further assessment, or redevelopment. And so we've partnered today with NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology. They are the technical assistance for Brownfields provider for Region 4, EPA Region 4, so that they're a resource to us in the state. They're a resource to individual communities throughout. To talk a little bit more about what do we do as these sites are coming up, as they've been assessed, what are the next steps and what are the resources out there specifically for grant opportunities, further procurement, and they're there to assist you. They're going to tell you a little bit about their services and then jump in to the process of redeveloping these sites as well. I've asked them to be a little bit more focused on sites that have already started this process, not necessarily identification. So we hope that this will be viable to your projects that are ongoing. And I want to say a special thank you to the South Carolina Department of Environmental Services now. Last week, they were South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control, SCDHEX, now SCDES, for co-sponsoring this and for partnering with us throughout the year and the program on all of the assessment work that's going across the state and their team. A couple of housekeeping things. You do see chats coming up on the bottom, just kind of telling you about how this is going to run. There's going to be a couple of times for questions during this as the presenters rotate and break out. And so if you do have a question or a comment, please use the chat function for that, and then they will answer those as we go. But there are some breaks throughout the presentation for questions that will be coming in to be answered and to be addressed. This is also being recorded, and so it will be there as a resource as well. We'll have a link to that to send out afterwards. So with that, that's my introduction. We're glad that everybody's here today, and I will turn it over to the NJIT folks.
Great. Thank you, Tyler. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to tell you a little bit more about who we are and our program and what we can offer you before we jump into the rest of today's programming. So you should be able to see my screen now. Can I just get a thumbs up from my...
We're good.
Okay, great. All right, thank you. So my name is Cailyn Bruno. I am the Director of Environmental Services here at NJIT TAB. And NJIT TAB stands for New Jersey Institute of Technology, Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities. That's why we just say NJIT TAB. Otherwise, it's a mouthful. But this is the TAB program is a competitive program through the EPA. We're fully funded through the EPA to provide free technical assistance to communities in Region 4. We've been doing this for a long time, since 2008, not necessarily in Region 4, but other regions throughout mostly the Eastern US. And there's two main things that I would like for you to remember about our program. The first thing is that we are an independent resource. So we will be talking a lot today about the EPA Brownfield Grant Program, but you don't need to be a grant recipient to get our free technical assistance. You don't even have to be interested in applying to the EPA program to get our free technical assistance. Any community, municipality, nonprofit, public institution is eligible for our services to overcome brownfield challenges. And that could mean a lot of different things. The second, probably most important thing to understand about our program is that our assistance is free. So when I talk about our assistance, our program has three main components to it. First, we have the Brownfield Academy. We also do community engagement and educational forums and one-on-one technical assistance. Our Brownfield Academy, I say it's essentially our website, but it's really a lot more than that. We have a lot of really great resources on here. We put a lot of effort into breaking down some of these more complex brownfields regulatory issues, technical issues, and make them more digestible and easy to understand. We have how-to videos, infographics. One of my favorite resources we have on here are successful grant applications for you to take a look at. We also have contacts on there, a lot of really great stuff. So I would recommend this would be your first stop if you're just getting started along this brownfield redevelopment journey. The second aspect of our program is the community engagement and educational forums. On the slide here is our menu of different forums that we provide to communities. This today being one of them. We'll do Brownfield Basics. So if you're brand new to the Brownfields concept, this would be appropriate. We'll also do a lot of community workshops. We get requests from communities who want to learn more and do a deeper dive on brownfield related topics. We'll do this, for example, brownfields and renewables, or brownfields and resilience, really any topic that brownfields touches, which really is limited by your imagination. We also do some more fun interactive events. One is Breaking Brownfields and IAWG. These are kind of like interactive Shark Tank-like events. So we have a wide variety of educational forums that we can provide. And the real, okay, so here's an example. We like to do community brownfield inventory workshops where we'll provide some custom mapping, spread them out on tables. Together, we'll look at them, determine what's a brownfield, what's not, where are the gray areas in your community, and together build an inventory so then you can get started on the next aspects of brownfields redevelopment. We can also do community site reuse visioning. So we can facilitate those conversations with the community, what they'd like to see done with the site. Something I like to point out here is that we're not a consulting firm, so we won't do engineering, renderings, that sort of thing. That's beyond our capabilities. But we can get some good concepts rolling for you. We can also do this online. We try to make it interactive and fun. So it's tailored really to what your community needs, in person or online or hybrid. The last, but I think most important aspect of our program is the one-on-one technical assistance. You see these bullets here on this slide. This is not a menu. These are just examples of the assistance that we can provide, but really every brownfield is different. Every community is different. So we really tailor our assistance to the community's needs. Again, we can help you if you're just getting started, or even if you already have a pretty sophisticated brownfields program going and you need help marketing a site, you're kind of at that tail end of the process, we can help you in between. So I'll just leave this up here for a moment for you to take a look at. identifying funding sources, thinking about planning, blueprinting where your funding is going to come from. We can help you with that. And I like to give you two specific examples here. The map shown on the right was a community that came to us. They've had this particular site, it's been abandoned for like a century at this point. It's definitely a brownfield. And over the past couple decades, some work has been done, but finally now there's the political will to redevelop this site. So they needed assistance pulling together what has been done on the site, where the sampling has occurred. So we mapped that digitally for them. The red dots you could see, those are sample locations where there is confirmed contamination, but we're also able to show where sampling didn't occur. So where they'd have to go back out to collect samples to delineate the identified issues on the site. The other colors on the map show some different site constraints. So it's not just environmental, but we were able to pull in the flood zones and the topography and identify in the orange hatch. These are the two probably developable areas of the site. We looked at the zoning, setbacks, all of that. So now given this mapping and the background work that we did, we were able to develop a potential scope of work that they're able to pull together, now go out, get some solid quotes from consultants so they can know how much it's going to cost to close the site, right? So now they have a plan for the next couple of steps. We also did some inventory work. That's a map on the left. We can do mapping, color coding, and this is really accessible. You don't need any sort of like fancy software to open this interactive map. Those dots are clickable. Bubble will come up with different site information, and that's just on Google Maps, so everyone has access to that. And one of the most important aspects of our program is that we will review your grant application. So we will give you really specific feedback. We will provide you links of where exactly to find the information. And I think, that's also really valuable for a lot of communities. So that's the overview of who we are, what we can provide for you. The rest of today's agenda, after this, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Elise. She's going to go over the Brownfield redevelopment process, just do an overview of that, introduce the EPA Brownfields grants. Then I'll come back and talk about the role of all appropriate inquiry in the EPA process. We're going to pause for some Q&A. And again, if throughout the presentations you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And then Carrie, this is a little out of order, but then I will kick it over to Carrie and she will be going in depth into procurement. And then we'll also have another chance for Q&A. So I'll just put up our information again while Elise gets her presentation ready.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elise Molleur, and I'm going to be talking about the Brownfield redevelopment process and EPA Brownfield grants. And as Cailyn introduced, I am a Brownfield redevelopment specialist with NJIT TAB. So we're going to start with the basics, of course, which is just the overall definition of a brownfield according to the EPA. And that is real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. And of course, we first build ourselves up by talking about the downs. So the negative impact of brownfields are pretty easy to point out. Brownfields can contribute to neighborhood deterioration and negative perceptions of the neighborhood. They also stigmatize areas and the populations residing there. They can attract vandals, open dumping, or other unwanted criminal activity. They can degrade soil, water, air quality, and also pose public health risks. And they can lower property values, reduce employment opportunities, and can also lead to lost tax revenue and limited economic growth. So combined, these impacts raise issues of social equity and environmental justice, as they're not typically felt equally by all communities. Brownfield communities tend to be more minority, more low income, less proficient in English, and having attained less of a formal education when compared to the greater US population. But everything has a silver lining. See what I did there? Brownfields also come with advantages. Many are located along waterways and rail lines and in downtown areas, which give them a locational advantage for redevelopment. They may also hold historical and architectural significance, and many already have existing infrastructure such as utility and sewer lines, which would also make these properties more attractive than land that had not been previously developed. So simply put, when we clean up brownfield sites, we improve the environment. Brownfields can also be redeveloped to deal with climate change issues such as persistent flooding by creating land uses that store floodwater, like restored wetlands, rain gardens, microforests, or permeable pavement. Redeveloping brownfield sites can improve a community's economic conditions by catalyzing economic development, creating jobs, increasing tax revenue, and diversifying the local economic base. And redeveloping brownfield sites helps to improve social equity in many different ways, including by removing health and safety hazards, removing eyesores and improving community appearances, alleviating community fears and worries, and also transforming the properties into community-needed uses. This can be affordable housing, recreation, schools, healthcare facilities, and so much more. So really, redeveloped brownfields are key ingredients to creating economically, environmentally, and socially equitable communities. But the process of cleaning up and redeveloping contaminated properties can be a daunting task, especially for local governments and nonprofits. At a minimum, this process involves determining the presence of contaminants in the soil, water, air, and building materials, understanding the state's regulatory process, identifying and navigating the myriad of funding and financing options, engaging your community, hiring and managing consultants and contractors, and then overall seeing the redevelopment activities or marketing the properties to real estate developers. Sorry, let's go back there. So there's really no set recipe, but there is a generalized process for brownfield redevelopment. There's also necessary steps that you want to take during this. So here's the different stages of the process, but it's not always linear. It's possible to have some hiccups along the way of the redevelopment process that can put your project on hold for a day, month, years, such as elected officials coming and going, or funding sources only being available for a certain stage of this process. And I'm going to be talking about funding in just a moment. So the most foundational stage is planning. This is where you assemble your team and perform your inventory. Like most challenges, you first need to understand the scope of the problem at hand. And in the past few years, the EPA has placed a lot more emphasis on the planning process through grant applications. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about some activities that you should get started on now if you plan on applying for an EPA grant in the future. Then your qualified environmental professional will walk you through the site assessment, investigation, and cleanup. During the site assessment stage, an environmental professional will be researching the site and generating reports like a phase 1 environmental site assessment or ESA, or a phase 2 ESA. In this process, any potential contamination would be identified and delineated through sampling of the soil, groundwater, air, or building materials. Then site remediation is conducted to properly clean up the site to applicable standards. So if your reuse vision is a residential building, your cleanup standards are going to be stricter than they would if you were developing a community basketball court or a soccer field. There's also some things that should be done throughout the entirety of your redevelopment project. These include meaningful community engagement. The community really is the star of the show. Finding more funding sources and navigating those. Building partnerships, which creates a strongly rooted support network. And of course, staying open to revisiting your site reuse vision as things change. So we're going to be discussing 4 types of brownfield grants. These are the multipurpose assessment revolving loan fund or RLF and cleanup. This is also known as the EPA MARC grants. These are the 4 EPA brownfield grants, kind of a little bit in depth more. So the multipurpose grant provides funding for a range of planning, assessment, and cleanup activities at 1 or more brownfield sites in target areas. The assessment grants provide funding for activities like making brownfield inventories, planning, environmental assessments, and community outreach. The RLF, or Revolving Loan Fund grants, provide funding to capitalize loans that are used to clean up brownfields. And then the cleanup grant's pretty self-explanatory. It provides funding to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites by the applicant. The EPA solicits these grants on an annual basis. So I'm going to go back to the little graphic for our brownfield redevelopment process, but this time I've identified the EPA MARC grants and at which stages of the process they can provide funding for. So the multi-purpose grant can cover activities conducted during the planning, site assessment, and site remediation phases. The assessment grant covers activities in the planning and site assessment stages. And then the cleanup and RLF grant cover activities conducting during site remediation or cleanup. So who's eligible for EPA brownfield grants? That's going to be your state, county, local governments, tribal nations, and nonprofit organizations. And as I mentioned earlier, the EPA solicits these grants on an annual basis. So the typical solicitation cycle will start with the request for applications, or RFA, being released in early fall. The application submission date is approximately 6 weeks after the RFA. Then the EPA announces the successful applicants in the following spring. And finally, the funding becomes available to grantees in late summer. So it's a timeline of roughly 1 year from that initial request for applications, or RFA, to the final step where the grant funds are available to the successful applicant. So why is starting early important in preparing a competitive application? First, and as I mentioned earlier, there's roughly 6 weeks from the request for applications to the submission date. 6 weeks may sound like a lot if we're talking vacation, but when it comes to putting a grant application together, it's a pretty tight deadline. On top of that, the submission dates are usually during the fall, which is typically a very busy time of the year for most people. School's back in session, the holidays are coming, I hope you have your Halloween costume planned out, and football's back, of course. Second, it builds a solid planning foundation or continues existing planning efforts. As I already mentioned, in past years, the EPA has put much more emphasis on the planning associated with the project. And although some planning activities are eligible under these grants, most successful applicants began the planning process well in advance of applying. Regardless of the funding sources that you may be pursuing, it's always recommended that projects be based on sound planning practices. And third, it provides time to address EPA application emphasis areas. Again, you only have 6 weeks to prepare the application, and EPA emphasis areas may change from the previous year. So having certain tasks completed prior to the request for application gives you more time during the 6-week window to focus on the new emphasis area criteria. And lastly, as Cailyn said, it allows for more involved technical assistance like NJIT Tab. NJIT Tab is a free resource to communities, and just one of the many services that Cailyn hit on that we provide is grant application review and critiques. So instead of sending us your application just before submission, you can send it earlier and we can provide assistance throughout its preparation. You can reach out to us daily, weekly, you can reach out to us once, but giving more time to allow that critiques allows for more technical assistance to be involved. So for all the EPA brownfield grants, the narrative ranking criteria is broken down into 4 major sections. Section 1 includes project area description and plans for revitalization. Section 2 includes community need and community engagement. Section 3 includes task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. And then Section 4 includes programmatic capability and past performance. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're going to focus on activities associated with the criteria within Sections 1 and 2 of the application narrative, which can be started early. These sections are essentially the essay contest sections where you're going to make your case for community need and highlight community involvement. Sections 3 and 4 of the application narrative are more pro forma in nature. So the tasks that we're going to focus on today that provide the basis for the first 2 narrative criteria sections include community engagement, partnerships, demographic and health data collection, identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation, geographic and target area identification, brownfields identification and prioritization, and priority brownfield site information. There's a lot of ins at the end of those sentences, but that's what we're going to be focusing on. So a critical element of a competitive EPA brownfield grant application is the development of an inclusive and effective community engagement plan. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have all of the tasks associated with community engagement completed prior to submission, but you can start thinking about what your engagement plan will look like and begin the outreach process. One example of where these activities can be initiated is in the identification and prioritization of the brownfield sites that you will highlight in your application. So having the community play a part in the identification of these sites will show community support and also consideration for your project. And it helps define what the overall goals are and how they meet the community's needs. On top of that, it's common that your community members will know about the brownfields in their neighborhoods and maybe even have more community information than some of your brownfields task force. Some of these people might be living right next to a brownfield. They look at it every day. Maybe their kids venture over into the yard. They might know what it used to be, how long it's been vacant. So it's really helpful for reaching out to the community as well. So it's very important to effectively engage the community for the success of a redevelopment project, as well as improving your brownfield grant application. You may have already conducted community engagement activities that support this. If so, you should identify and document those activities and make sure that the community engagement plan that you include in your application incorporates them. There are several typical partners involved in brownfields redevelopment. So for instance, agencies of the federal government, such as the US EPA, provide funding, assistance, and expertise. Territorial economic and environmental development agencies also bring important resources to brownfield redevelopment projects. Then we have real estate professionals, which can help communities better understand the realities of the real estate market and can also suggest various incentives that would help make local brownfield redevelopment projects economically viable. A university or college can be a valuable partner in brownfields redevelopment, like professors, researchers, and graduate students may provide insight and experience on brownfield-related topic. Some universities and colleges host design studios in which students can work on real-world redevelopment projects. Other typical partners include banks or lenders, chamber of commerce or business owners, neighborhood associations and other community groups, nonprofits, environmental consultants, environmental justice organizations, and in some cases, you need to go beyond the usual suspects. Of course, I'm getting a call right now. Let me just stop that right now. Sorry about that. They knew I was on a webinar. So there are other groups and organizations that you can add value to your brownfields redevelopment team. They can offer unique and important resources. So for instance, local artists and cultural institutions. They can be great partners in bringing attention to brownfield sites, like suggesting creative ways to engage the community in envisioning the property's reuse, and also creatively marketing the sites. The second element of a competitive application that should be worked on early is demographic and health data. This is essentially the data that establishes community need. So why is it important? Well, first, it quantifies community needs and challenges. A strong application doesn't just make statements without the data to support those claims. You want to include data such as poverty rates, unemployment, loss of tax base, population decline, as well as health statistics like cancer rates, asthma rates, infant mortality, heart disease, and so on. Also, comparative data such as target area versus county, state, or national rates can be very compelling, and it's also critical to establishing community need. Second, it supports the community story. A strong brownfields application always tells a compelling story, and that story is comprised of three broad elements. First, you're going to outline the problem and challenges faced by the community. Then you're going to outline how you're going to remedy those problems and challenges. And finally, you're going to outline what the results will be, or the outcomes. So as I stated earlier, you're going to need to quantify and confirm those needs to support your story. Data is really just data until you weave that into a story and give your community its voice. If you want to hear more about how to effectively tell your community's story, check out the storytelling webinar that I conducted several months ago that is on our website, just a little plug in there. And finally, it helps identify project goals by identifying and supporting community needs and challenges, which should be the things you address in your project outcomes. Another element of grant application is the identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation. So as I mentioned earlier, and I'm trying to place a lot of emphasis on this, the EPA places a lot of emphasis on planning related to these brownfield application projects. This is because a project that has a solid planning foundation has a greater chance of success. Good planning is a great indicator of community support and commitment to taking projects from beginning all the way through to redevelopment. It's not only important in the eyes of the EPA, but also developers want to see that they will have minimal obstacles in developing a property. And for any developer, time is money and a huge factor in whether a project is financially viable or not. Some plans you should consider when developing your brownfield application include target area specific redevelopment plans, master plans, zoning, and transportation plans. You also want to make sure that these plans relate to your proposed project. In some cases, there may not be any relevant plans like the ones I just mentioned. However, any stakeholder or community engagement findings would also be considered planning to support a project. There are several sources of data that you should consider to identify and support your target area. I'm not going to go through all of those listed here, but I would like to mention 3 that are very useful for high-level identification of areas that suffer disproportionate level of environmental burden. These are the EPA EJ Screen. This is a mapping and screening tool based on nationally consistent data that combines environmental and demographic indicators in maps and reports. If you visit the website, there are instructions on how to use the tool and understand the results that it generates. Then we have EPA EnviroFacts. This is a database that enables users to retrieve environmental information from multiple sources for whatever area you're interested in. So you simply just put in the address, zip code, city, county, water body, or park name, and whatever environmental data, such as air quality, water quality, or toxins is available, it's going to retrieve it for you. And then we have CJEST, or the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. This is a tool that has an interactive map and uses data sets that are indicators of burdens in 8 categories: climate change, energy, health, housing, legacy pollution, transportation, waste and wastewater, and workforce development. The tool uses this information to identify communities that are experiencing burdens like those. And these tools are fairly user-friendly, and the advantage of them is that they draw on multiple sources of data to highlight those underserved communities. So I highly recommend checking them out. Another thing to remember that I think is pretty important is that while you're gathering your data, you want to make sure that you're checking and sourcing data from multiple sources rather than just one. So, what is a geographic area? Well, in simple terms, it's the area that you're going to conduct eligible activities with your grant funds. Your geographic boundary should include an area that suffers from brownfield challenges and impacts that you can quantify with data. It can also include the applicants and in some cases, a coalition member's jurisdictional or service area boundaries or a sub-area of those boundaries. Regardless of the area selected, it should make sense in terms of your overall project plan and goals. And you also want to make sure that you specifically describe the boundaries of your geographic area using roadways, rail lines, rivers, and so on. Now, a target area is basically an area within that geographic area that has some type of cohesive element that distinguishes it. So for example, a downtown district, a community gateway, a waterfront area, an industrial district, or corridors like a railway or a highway. Target areas also typically have common characteristics, such as being communities that are environmental justice, underserved, aging, and/or minority. And therefore, they typically suffer from a lack of affordable housing, food deserts, a lack of investment, high unemployment rates, lack of services, and so on. Excuse me. The last element that I want to discuss is the brownfield identification and prioritization. So choosing the best sites to include in your application can really make or break your brownfield grant application. But why is it so important? First, it shows a comprehensive approach and that you've given careful thought to how you're going to approach the project. Second, it makes the best case for your application story. You want to choose sites that have the best associated data to make your case. And third, it focuses project goals. By that, I mean, if your project goal is open and green space, you want to have selected sites that can accommodate this type of reuse and is supported by consistent planning. When you select your sites, you want to think about questions and factors such as, is there an existing brownfield inventory? And are you drawing sites from that inventory? Is a site located within your target area or project emphasis areas such as a downtown or gateway? Does the site meet the EPA's definition of a brownfield? Step 1. Confirm with the EPA regional office that your site is eligible. Does the data associated with the priority sites highlight your community's challenges to the greatest extent possible? And in considering if your priority sites have the potential to meet your project goal or goals, you should consider if it meets the definition of a brownfield, what the ownership is, any past site uses and what they are, contamination, what's contaminating it, the extent of it, structures, wetlands, floodplain, if the site's secured, and any available infrastructure. Now, I know that was a lot of information, especially for, I think, 10:30 a.m., but I just want to stress about how important it is that if you do want to apply for an EPA MARC grant, just getting started early. So hopefully I'm drilling that right into everyone's heads. But we're going to move on to the more technical aspects of grant writing, and that is requirements to submit an application. So note that this is an order of how it should be completed, and it's going to be activating a SAM.gov account through your deadline, then obtaining a unique entity identifier or UEI generated in SAM.gov. Once you have your UEI, you can activate your grants.gov account, and then the authorized organization representative, or the AOR, is going to submit your grant application on grants.gov. Excuse me. If you've already done this for other projects or programs and you already have a UEI, check it anyway to make sure that your account is active through the deadline. The past couple of years, this has been before Thanksgiving. So if it expires this summer, you'll want to make sure that you reactivate it. Just make sure you check when it expires. It needs to be reactivated manually. Some other pieces of advice: don't use someone else's UEI. Keep in mind that you have to be the authorized org representative to submit the application through grants.gov. Need to know and remember your password. If you are like me and you use the same password for everything except you add an exclamation point at the end, you might need to spice things up. I highly recommend a password manager. Saved my life. So here's what it looks like when you get started registering your organization in SAM.gov. Before you sit down to do it, look at this checklist on the right and gather all the stuff that you will need for this. It is a lot. For example, you don't just input your address, you need certain documents to provide proof that that is your address. It might take you a little bit to gather all this stuff, and you definitely don't want to be scrambling to do this the day it's due. So you can and should start now. Another thing that I want to note, the website will give you the option to do a UEI only without registration, but you don't want to do this if you intend on applying for a grant. Water break. All right, so the grants.gov workplace is where you're going to submit your grant application. In addition to the project narrative, you'll also need to fill out these forms. So I'm going to break it down to put it plainly. SF424 is going to hold all the information that pertains to your organization. 424A is a budget sheet breakdown. 5700-54 is where you will identify all the key contacts for your project. And then 4704 is the form that you fill out that the EPA reviews to basically confirm that you are eligible for federal funding. A state letter is required for all grant types. For multipurpose assessment and RLF, it's just basically an acknowledgement letter from the state saying that they're aware that you're applying for the grant. For cleanup, it's more in depth. The EPA is asking the state to verify that the site is ready for cleanup. This means going back and looking at all the work that's been done by reviewing previous reports to make sure no other investigation work needs to be done. This is going to take some time. The offices are usually really busy, but they'll work with you. Just the more notice, the better. And speaking of cleanup grants, there's another unique requirement, and that's community notification and outreach along with your ABCA. Excuse me. Analysis of brownfields cleanup alternatives. This is where you're going to inform the community of what your plan is for cleanup. Think about the lead time that will be needed for this. You need to set the date for the outreach event at least 14 days before you submit the application. You need to give the public opportunity to review your plans, make comments on it, and you need to compile those comments and any responses. So do you really want to wait until they release the guidelines, or can you get these activities rolling this summer, at least finalizing your ABCA and being confident with your selected remedy? Now, lastly, I'm going to end with some tips and tricks for EPA Brownfield grant applications. These are: read the guidelines and resource materials thoroughly. Read the fine print, read everything. All the directions are on there. Follow the guideline outline. Don't get creative. This is a big thing because a happy reviewer tends to be, hopefully, a happy outcome. So just follow the rules, follow the guidelines. Don't need to get creative. Use tables when appropriate. Do not include maps or photos in the application. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Don't skip questions because you don't have information or data. I was working with a rural community that had no surveyors coming out to these communities and taking data and statistics on how many people or how many children have asthma or the cancer rates in these neighborhoods, in these communities. And so they talked with their EPA reviewer after not getting a grant, and their EPA reviewer said, still have to say that this data doesn't exist, or you don't have access to this data. So even if this data does not exist for your community, you still have to say it. So just make sure that you include that. Don't just ignore or move on from something. Do not add hyperlinks to data or other information. So going back to maps or photos in your application, the EPA reviewers cannot leave the 10 to 15 pages of a grant application. They can't click on any hyperlinks. They can't go and look at maps or photos. So if you say, please refer to figure 1, they can't go and check that out. Now, there are required attachments that they can look at, and that's what I spoke about before. But just know that they can't leave the pages. So don't include hyperlinks, don't refer to any maps or photos. Get one person to edit the application, and then get someone who knows nothing about the project to review your application. This is super important. Your EPA reviewer likely has never stepped foot where you're talking about. They have no idea about the geographic area. They have no idea about the community, the demographics. So if you have someone who knows nothing about your project review it, and maybe they have questions at the end, your EPA reviewer is also going to have questions. And then if you hire a consultant, make sure that they tell the story that you want told. So if you're interested in learning more about grant writing, I know that was a lot of information. My colleague Sean Vroom conducted a webinar on grant writing and getting started early back in mid-June. It was incredibly useful and an informative webinar, and even went through common mistakes and errors that applicants might make in each section of the grant applications. I believe Fatima is going to post the link in chat towards that webinar as I stop sharing my slides and pass the mic over to Cailyn. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Elise. That was a lot of information, really good, valuable information for anyone who is interested in applying for those EPA grants. Okay, so we're going to be talking about all appropriate inquiry and the Brownfields redevelopment process. It's not a very exciting topic, but it's very near and dear to my heart, especially for an audience like this, municipalities. You know, you want to be very aware of the risks that you're getting involved with when you embark on your brownfield redevelopment process. It's really important to understand this topic and this aspect of the process, because this is a common pitfall that we see with communities and nonprofits. Like, either they're too afraid of the liabilities to initiate the brownfield process, or are a little too cavalier and inadvertently expose themselves to risk while disqualifying themselves from being eligible for those EPA grants that we've talked about. Elise already went over this in depth. For this discussion about all appropriate inquiry, liability, and then by extension, environmental risk, you can think of working within this structure, this framework, as a way to minimize your environmental risk in these property transactions. You might have heard of a phase 1 environmental site assessment. So it seems like some of you have already gone through that process, and that gives you liability protection, or more accurately, liability limitation. But why? How is that even true? This requirement is outlined in the law, actually, that covers much of the federal Brownfields program. It's called the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. And this act establishes requirements for all appropriate inquiry, and of which performing phase 1 environmental site assessments is part of that. And this is a process that you initiate before you acquire the property, okay? Bold, underline, italic, before you acquire the property, in order to illuminate the potential environmental risks, so you're not going into the transaction blind. And yes, it's true, if you follow these requirements, I'm going to outline them in the next couple slides, you will get liability protection. But it's important to understand that you will be responsible for cleaning up the site. So I want to dive into this a little more. So I often hear this from local governments, municipalities, that they're concerned about liability And that's why they're afraid to maybe foreclose on some of these derelict properties or even get into the chain of title at all because they don't want to be exposed to risk. So then when I ask them, well, what do you mean by liability? What would be your risk? What's your perception of that risk? I always hear that, well, then we'd be responsible to clean it up. And that's true. But you should know that the law actually does go beyond that too. So not only would you be responsible for the cleanup, but all the testing and the work, the investigation work that leads up to being able to do that cleanup, you'd be responsible for that as well. Any sort of monitoring and management that happens after the cleanup, you'd be responsible for. Depending on exposure, how bad the contamination was, how far it spread, and who it impacted, you might be responsible for setting up medical evaluations or even, finding a new source of drinking water for a community. The costs associated with that can be pretty large. If there's a regional contamination issue and you need to do some forensics to figure out what your site's contribution to that is, that can be pretty pricey. A big aspect that we're seeing a little more of now is that this law provides the basis for recovery for natural resource damages. So you can think of this as a civil type of suit that, like, where there are damages to the ecology or the impact to the community. Maybe a water body was impacted and the community can't fish for a food source there, that sort of thing. So for a community with limited resources, like, no, thank you, right? There's no way we're going to expose ourselves to that amount of risk. And again, all this is spelled out in the CERCLA law. And when they passed the law, it was very strict on polluters and anyone in the chain of title, anyone who transported any sort of waste to or from these sites. They were all under the umbrella of responsibility. So the good news is, though, that this law has been updated and allows for some additional protections for local governments as long as you meet the threshold criteria. So here's just the snippet of the updated law. This happened in 2018. The EPA revised their definition of owner-operator in CERCLA because, they realized that an unintended consequence of being really strict was that they weren't promoting the reuse of brownfields on a local level. So in this revision, they clarified that it exempts from the definition of owner-operator a unit of state or local government which acquired the ownership or control through seizure or otherwise in connection with law enforcement activity or through bankruptcy, tax delinquency, abandonment, or other circumstance. There is an exception to this, though, and this is important for you to understand, is that if your unit of local government has contributed to the contamination, you don't qualify for this exemption. Some common examples that we see here are DPW sites where they service vehicles. They might have gas tanks, and also these former town dumps, which almost every community has. So in addition to that clarification in the CERCLA law, in order to encourage beneficial reuse of sites, CERCLA gives guidelines on how to proceed with a brownfield transaction in a way that limits your liability for those various scary financial risks. There are 3 thresholds or minimum requirements that must be met in order to limit your liability. And these must be met before you acquire or purchase the property. So the first is doing your due diligence, performing all appropriate inquiry. This is where your phase 1 comes in. The second is establishing you're not affiliated or a subsidiary of the polluting party. And the third says there are you comply with continuing obligations. And this is where your responsibility for cleaning up the site and addressing the site contamination comes into play. So the law lays out what these continuing obligations are. A lot of them are pretty straightforward, but the one to pay attention to is that you need to take reasonable steps with respect to the contamination. According to the rules, you need to take reasonable steps to address the contamination on your property. So even if you aren't liable for that whole list on my previous slide, you'll still need to, again, address the contamination to maintain your limited liability status. Additionally, keep in mind, depending on how you want to reuse the site, you will need to clean it up to a certain standard. So again, this is something that Elise touched on briefly as well, but is your site reuse going to be a warehouse, or is it going to be a playground where kids might potentially actually be eating the dirt, right? So those are two different exposure scenarios, and your level of cleanup might depend on what your site reuse is. So this is why all appropriate inquiry is important. Actually, that first step, it will help you understand what is in store for you and what you'd be responsible for should you move ahead with this property transaction. So even if you do already get the protection based on that revised definition, I still very much recommend you perform all appropriate inquiry if possible before that site gets into your portfolio. So not only are these threshold criteria necessary for liability limitation, what I've been talking about, but it's also mandatory for EPA grant funding of the properties you own as well. So you can use an assessment grant to perform all appropriate inquiry on properties that you don't own. But if you already own a site and you apply for a cleanup grant, you have to make sure you've had that phase 1 done before you acquire the property, if that makes sense. So let's dive into all appropriate inquiry. The definition is the process of evaluating a property's environmental conditions and assessing the likelihood of any contamination. Before we purchase a property, we want to be able to prove that we're not responsible for the existing conditions on the site. We want to baseline the conditions of how the site is, its history, and we want to carefully document all of this. So, and I want to emphasize too that all appropriate inquiry are the minimum requirements. So performing a phase 1 before you get the property is good, but if you can go out and do some sampling and extend that to a phase 2 before acquiring a property, that's even better. All appropriate inquiry is a basic process of how we go about establishing these environmental conditions, and this is really detailed in the standard, which is ASTM 1527. Here's that process. So the circular rule, again, says that we need all appropriate inquiry to assess environmental conditions and the likelihood that those conditions cause contamination. We accomplish this through the phase 1 environmental site assessment. This is a report essentially that incorporates all the minimum things that you need to document. That ASTM standard tells you exactly how to write the phase 1 and how to perform it. And the goal of the phase 1 is to identify recognized environmental conditions, or RECs for short. And then on the right here, if you're submitting a phase 1 to EPA for all appropriate inquiry, they are strict about certain things. They want the report to clearly opine on the RECs, that you're clear where there's data gaps. They really, really need the qualified environmental professional's signature. That is essential. And then whether or not some additional investigation is recommended. That needs to be clearly spelled out, like in the conclusion section of your phase 1. So a recognized environmental condition, these are the presence of hazardous substances or petroleum products in, on, or at the subject property due to a release to the environment. It's the likely presence of these contaminants at the subject property due to a release or a likely release to the environment, or it's the presence of these contaminants under conditions that pose a material threat to a future release to the environment. In my opinion, I will tell this audience this. So when you get a phase 1, a good phase 1 will list out all of the recs. I have noticed that some consultants like to make a blanket rec, like they'll just identify one and they'll say it's the historical use of the property, where there's other obvious recs, like a drum storage area or documented leaky tanks. In my opinion, not calling these out specifically isn't very helpful, because you can use this document as the basis for the next steps of knowing what you're responsible for addressing in the investigation and cleanup. So if you can imagine a former gas station, you have the area where the tanks were stored, you have all the product lines leading to the pump stations. If they service any vehicles there, did they have any grease traps or other chemicals stored on the site? You'll want to know where those are so you can go and sample those specific areas. It's not very helpful just to say, oh, well, this was formerly a gas station. And, so that's just my advice, something you should look out for when you are getting these reports from your consultants. I'm going to lead you through a little activity. So we're going to pretend that we are performing some due diligence on some sites here. I'm going to show you a picture of the inside of this site and the outside. So first, we're going to do a little recon of the inside. And you should be able to, with your cursor, circle areas of this picture that you think might represent a release, a future release. They might pose a material threat of a future release. So what do you think would be some areas that then you'd want to go ahead and identify as a rec and follow up with some future sampling? See, I think maybe if you use the pen, I'm going to put mine as red. So hopefully you can see. I would say here, definitely, right? We can see a discharge from this rusty drum that's not properly stored. Neither is this one. We have a cabinet here. Yes, the floor drain right next to some improperly stored drums. You might have had some stuff leak down there. The floor here doesn't look to be in a good condition. I don't know if that's the ground, but you could imagine some of the discharge from these drums making its way, and that would be how the soil itself could be exposed to some discharge. Let's see, any other obvious ones? See some machinery, some generally not good housekeeping. Obviously, this building seems old. You can also, in your due diligence, get some testing done to see if this paint maybe is contains lead. Maybe some of the different areas, there's floor tiles or piping where you might have some asbestos concerns. Now let's take a walk around outside. It's kind of hard to maneuver here. So again, this site is looking not so great. We have junk everywhere, but does any of this seem like it could be a material threat of a release? We saw an exhaust fan on the, oh yeah, tank storage. Here I see an exhaust fan and some distressed vegetation. Sometimes if we have a lot of vapors that are being exhausted through the air, that can form some condensation and drip and impact the soil that way. Also looking at this area, you know, this kind of electric infrastructure, if there are any sort of transformers on the site that could contain PCBs, stained. Yes, we have some staining here on the concrete. Very good. This concrete's kind of crappy, right? There's cracks everywhere. You could see this discharge being able to make its way into the soil. And then unfortunately, maybe into the groundwater, and then you'd have a bigger problem. So, all right. So thank you for humoring me with this. We'll get back to my presentation. So you can see on a site, sometimes it is very obvious where these wrecks are, other times not so much. So how do we identify them? Just kind of course, site recon, what we just did virtually is an aspect of that. Visiting the site is very important. This is not like a pure desktop review. We're not going out and taking samples, but you do want a careful look at the site. Reviewing the site history, document review, whatever's available document-wise through the municipality, the county, maybe, interviewing people that might be familiar with the site. And so I'm showing it this way, not so much as a list of ways, or, you know, it's not like a list or a certain amount of steps that you need to do just to check off, but they all kind of work together. So I'm showing it like this, like to show visually that a better way to think of this is that you're assembling a phase one in an integrated approach. So each of these activities should be able to validate, confirm the other information. And at the end, someone should be able to read this phase one, have a clear idea of what the risks are, any of the data gaps, the multiple lines of evidence, and what the next steps are. Here's just the standard 1527 is very thorough. It even gives you a template structure to work through. So a lot of phase ones look the same, and that's why they're following this standard. A phase one usually has these three possible outcomes. So either you don't identify any wrecks, congratulations, you don't need any further assessment, or maybe there were some significant data gaps. Like I said, sometimes you don't have access to the site. So maybe you can only do a perimeter recon. You can't really get in there. That would be a data gap. You would need additional investigation information to see if wrecks are present. So you might need to proceed with more phase one activities and do a phase two, or you identify definite wrecks and you need to move to the next step in order to see if they are causing contamination or not. And that's when we're collecting soil samples, groundwater samples, that sort of thing. I do just want to end a note on, this is kind of breaking news here in the environmental world. So as of April, 2 PFAS compounds are considered hazardous substances by the EPA. These are what are called emerging contaminants. So we do have a whole list of typical contaminants that we see on site. It's kind of, you know, we've added some along the ways, but when we say PFAS, it's a suite of chemicals that are now being added to that typical list. And now that it's classified as a hazardous substance, now it's under the purview of the standard, and your phase 1 should incorporate a discussion of this, especially if your site was involved with any sort of like fire, if there was a fire on your site, or if it was a practice area for your local fire department, because the firefighting foams had a lot of these PFAS in them. Any sort of like food packaging, if your site was involved with like textile, waterproof textiles, some common household products, landfills. This is going to be an issue coming up. So just have an awareness of that. These should be like some red flag activities that might require some additional investigation. So we will pause now for some questions if we've had any come through. I did see one come through in the chat earlier. Do you offer topography services for the project? We don't have surveyors on staff. Again, some of these activities, if it involves going out to the site, doing surveying or collecting samples, that's not something we can do. But we can help you procure a consultant to do those activities for you. What we can do, if it is any sort of desktop review activity, and we do have some sophisticated mapping capabilities, we can do that for you. So showing some of those site constraints, if we can get our hands on existing topography mapping data, we can assess your site that way. Let's see. Give it another minute for any other questions. Carrie's going to be talking about procuring a consultant.
Cailyn, can I throw one in real quick?
Yeah.
Just for the group, you did a great job going over the all appropriate inquiry and the role of the phase 1. Could you talk a little bit about the timing of that before pre-purchase?
Yes. So a phase 1 must be conducted within a year before your acquisition date. So if you have a previous phase 1, it's 5 years old, unfortunately, it's going to have to be updated. And if certain aspects of your phase 1, like the interviews and document review, are more than 6 months old, that will also have to be updated before your property transaction. So if you have any specific questions about timing, I mean, there's all sorts of wacky stuff that can happen with these phase 1s. Definitely reach out to us. I'll emphasize that signature one. You know, we've been working with a community that had everything completed with the phase 1, but didn't have that QEP signature. Now they have to go out and get another one done because the EPA is not going to accept that. So you really want to make sure that you're following all the guidance on that.
Thank you. And I'll say that, you know, safest option for us that we found with folks in our municipalities and localities that we operate with in the state, It's just making sure that document is dated within 6 months
Yeah.
prior to acquisition. And I'll say as well, in the state of South Carolina, we do have the voluntary cleanup contract that provides additional liability protection, also outlines the requirements for cleanup, that activity on the back end or further assessment after entering into it. And that has the phase one requirement as well there. And can you talk a little bit about we talked about grants earlier on, the role of this phase one of being eligible for those EPA grants for these communities?
Can you ask that again? So the role of the state?
Yeah, the condition of the property has to be in what the solid appropriate inquiry does as far as being eligible for grant funding. And that might be a better question for Elise.
Yeah, Cailyn, do you want to take over that? Sorry, I'm just understanding the question a little bit, but that's on.
Yeah, so I mean, in the Brownfields grant process, you can use grant funding in order to do assessments. And that can include your all appropriate inquiry activities, like doing a phase one, doing a phase two prior to purchasing the property. So that would be done on, maybe there's a site that's just been hanging out there in your community. You're fixing to foreclose on it, but you want to initiate these activities before you actually go through that process and take that site into your portfolio, or get that into that chain of a chain of ownership. Does that answer?
I'm thinking from a cleanup side. I wasn't clear there. So
okay.
Yeah, so the ownership status, to be eligible for a cleanup grant, you would also have to go through this as well. And if you didn't, that knocks your eligibility out.
Exactly. Yeah. So in order to get one of those cleanup grants, you have to own the property, and you have to meet that threshold criteria showing that you're in no way responsible for the contamination on that property. So that includes having your all appropriate inquiry buttoned up, your phase one done within the proper time frame before you took ownership of the property. And look, they're going to ask for documentation of all of this. They're going to ask for that phase one. They're going to ask for documentation of when you acquire the property, and then they're going to look to see if that if you meet that threshold. And you can't be affiliated with the responsible party, and you have to show if it is in your if you do own it and you're going for cleanup, that you've taken due care with respect to the contamination on the property. And that's where that letter comes in that Elise had also alluded to, for the cleanup aspects. Like this, you need to get documentation from the state saying that, yes, this site, all the investigation has been done. We know exactly where the contamination is. It's ready for cleanup. So, talking about timing wise, getting all that stuff, all those ducks in a row, it does take planning, especially if you want to be able to be ready for the fall in order to apply for that grant funding.
Yeah. I met with an individual from a TAB provider in the country, and she had a shirt that said, "Have you had a phase one?" And it's in big, bold letters. So I think that's just a great way of advertising what Cailyn said is bold, underlined, just make sure you get that phase one.
Yeah. And look, even if you haven't, you can talk to us. I mean, sometimes it does happen in a municipal situation where you might accidentally get a suspicious property without a phase one. But yeah, just let us know if you need assistance, like meeting that threshold criteria and that definition to be eligible for the grant.
Thank you.
Okay, I think at this point we should kick it over to Carrie to talk about how you can procure a consultant without getting in trouble.
Thanks, Cailyn. So I want to talk about competitively procuring a contractor. So let's first talk about procurement and what it is and what it is not. So this quote you see here at the top, as a recipient of EPA financial assistance, you will likely find it necessary to purchase or procure professional services, supplies, or equipment in order to complete the work under your EPA awards. This comes from the Best Practices Guide for Procuring Services, Supplies, and Equipment under EPA Assistance Agreements. A lot of what I'm going to talk about today is informed by this document. I would encourage you to read it, as well as the Code of Federal Register, which I'll talk about later. And if you do have questions, to contact us as well as your EPA grant specialist. So let's talk about first what procurement is not. So we're not talking about personnel or current employees on your payroll. We're not talking about a sub-award of financial assistance. So if you're not familiar, a non-federal entity is a sub-recipient when they use federal funds for a public purpose, as opposed to providing goods or services for the benefit of the grant recipient themselves. We're also not talking about transferring funds between agencies of the same unit of government. And we're not talking about the supporting an individual through a stipend or travel allowances or other such things. What we are talking about is that in general, a procurement contractor is a for-profit firm or individual consultant, with very few exceptions. Also, there can be some situations when you enter into a procurement contract with a nonprofit for commercially available services, such as accounting. Procurement contractors typically provide goods and services on commercial terms, provide similar goods and services to many different purchasers, operate in a competitive environment, and a reasonable profit is allowable. So in order to get yourself ready for procurement, you need to make sure that you have a system for administering contracts, ensure there are no conflicts of interest, conduct cost or price analyses, and include contract clauses required by the Uniform Grant Guidance. So with very few exceptions, recipients have to follow a competitive process when using EPA funds, unless there's a micro purchase, which is the competition threshold I have here. In general, it's $10,000. Essentially, recipients may not use micro purchase procedures to just transfer funds to another non-federal entity. There has to be tangible work that is performed in order for it to count as a micro purchase. And you may be wondering why these regulations are in place. So the government wants to make sure that it's a fair and equitable competition, and you want to make sure that you get the best services for your project. And more importantly, it's the law. So services, supplies, and equipment have to be purchased or leased in compliance with the Universal Grant Guidance, or UGG, or Uniform Grant Guidance. And the procurement standards are found in the Code of Federal Register, or CFR, at 2 CFR 200. Additionally, EPA also has a separate set of regulations requiring that recipients make good faith efforts to use disadvantaged business enterprises. And I'll dig into all of this. So overall principles of procurement that you should keep in mind: you want to make sure you have a clear understanding of what you need and what you want. For example, before going out to bid for services, you want to understand what capabilities you have in-house and what capabilities that you don't have in-house, so you understand exactly what you need to procure for. Overall, I'm emphasizing that you need to make sure that you're in alignment with the federal rules and regulations. That's going to be specified in the Uniform Grant Guidance. You also have to understand the timeline and the process. Depending on what your needs are, what you don't have capacity for in-house, you can create a timeline and a process that is in line with what you need. You should also have a procurement team, which includes reviewers, evaluators, as well as a team lead. And you want to make sure that that procurement team is unbiased and knowledgeable. And then overall, got to make sure that we get this across. You want to make sure that you document your process and document exactly how it complies with not only federal regulations, but also state, local, or tribal regulations. Also, it's very important to note that your municipality or other organization might already have a procurement system. However, it is mandatory for the UGG that you have a system that meets the minimum standards of the UGG. So even if you have your own procurement system, it could have less stringent standards than what is federally regulated. So you have to make sure that your system is up to par or more stringent than the UGG. So there are a variety of procurement options. You can either have an RFP or an RFQ. An RFP, or request for proposals, is a process used to select just one firm to conduct professional services outlined in a scope of work, or an SOW. And a RFQ, or request for qualifications, is you're going to kind of build a bench of qualified consultants to choose from various work order tasks as required. And so for an RFP, an entity would put together a proposal, and for an RFQ, an entity would put together a statement of qualifications. And I'll go into more detail about this later, but in terms of choosing your bid, you have to make sure that cost is a consideration. So what do you not do? In conformance with the UGG, you should not seek or accept any assistance from a contractor when preparing your RFP or RFQ if that same contractor plans to submit an offer in response to that RFP or RFQ. You cannot accept a bid, proposal, any kind of offer from a contractor that provided you assistance in developing, drafting, or preparing it, that RFP or RFQ. Assistance from a private entity that's also not allowed includes situations in which the contractor provides a sample RFP or RFQ, or even just suggests that you look to another municipality or county as an example of how to fill out or put together an RFP or RFQ. If you're curious about what a proper solicitation document would look like, you can look online. You can ask an existing recipient for a copy of their documents, or you can contact the EPA's project officer or us at NJIT Tab for assistance. As well, consistent with the UGG, you cannot include language that restricts or limit competition. Again, the goal is to have a fair and open competition. So we can't give a particular contractor an advantage. So you can't have a stipulation that says, we're only going to accept proposals or qualifications from people with EPA Brownfield grant experience already, because that's a competition limiter. It doesn't allow firms that have experience in addressing contaminated properties or new firms entering the market to compete. Also, you cannot mention any other contractor in the RFP or RFQ, as this could discourage other contractors from submitting an offer. What you have to do to be in conformance with federal standards is you have to make a good faith effort to solicit proposals or quotes from disadvantaged business enterprises. The EPA unfortunately doesn't have a directory or list of minority business enterprises or women business enterprises. But they recommend checking out the Small Business Administration, the U.S. Department of Transportation or even the state of South Carolina may be able to provide you with those entities. The RFP or RFQ has to be publicly advertised on a website or through other means to promote a full and open competition. And the EPA recommends that you have a bidding period open for at least 30 calendar days. In the instance that you only receive one bid, you have to negotiate profit as a separate element of the contract. If you intend to award that one bidder an EPA-funded contract that exceeds $250,000, you have to negotiate a profit as a separate element. So you should ask the contractor to disclose its profit rate as part of negotiations, and also judge whether the profit rate is reasonable, either based on experience or researching info online about average profit rates for environmental consulting firms. If you select a contractor that's not offering the lowest bid, you have to document the rationale and basis for that. You may be required to provide this documentation to the EPA's grant management officer for review. And prior approval of the contract firms by the EPA's grant management officer may be required if they're concerned about your organization's compliance with the rules around competitive procurement. So in order to build a scope of work, you have to have a number of elements. So that includes project goals, what you want to achieve at the end of the day, a timeline, which includes proper benchmarks and deadlines, expected results. If you have an EPA assessment grant and you need procurement for a cleanup plan, you have to outline what elements of the cleanup plan need to be included. Conditions, so if-then statements, deliverables, what exact documents need to be delivered as part of the contract, and management, which will delineate how you interface as the government entity between your consultants so that they can deliver the services. When developing your scope of work, you want to make sure that it aligns with your goals. It aligns with your work plan that you submitted to the EPA as part of your grant, and that the tasks and resulting outcomes meet your needs. Your expectations in order to achieve success must be clear and concise. This is your contract with the consultant, and so you want to make sure that you minimize any vagaries. So another important element of procurement for legal reasons is cost price reasonableness. So in terms of federal regulations, price has to be a factor for any RFP or RFQ. The reasonableness of cost price proposals must be evaluated for the scope of services outlined in the RFP or RFQ and must be substantially weighted. This makes sure that the recipients are receiving the most advantageous offer with price and other factors considered for the work proposed by each bidder. The EPA recommends that the cost price reasonableness criterion is weighted at least 25%. I'll have this at the end as well, but there are supporting resources there to help you. I mentioned the best practices guide. The first appendix is on conducting a price and/or cost analysis, as well as Community Lattice's analysis of Brownfield's cost ABC tool. So let's talk about disadvantaged business enterprises, because that's another element of what is legally required for procurement under EPA grants. So legally, under federal regulations, a recipient of EPA funds has to make a good faith effort to contract with DBEs whenever procuring construction, equipment, services, and supplies under an EPA financial assistance agreement. The federal regulations require a recipient to document the methods used to adhere to good faith efforts and retain that documentation in their records. If you don't properly maintain your documentation, you may be considered non-compliant and this could result in remedial action. Some examples of proper documentation can include, but this is not an exhaustive list, email logs, phone logs, electronic searches and communications, handouts at conferences, flyers sent to DBEs or other similar records. If one or more of the good faith efforts that you make can't be performed, EPA recommends that the circumstances that noted like a hardship and precluded you from making those good faith efforts be documented and retained. Another thing to note that I have in this black box here is that each procurement contract signed for your EPA grant has to include the following term and condition. I won't necessarily read it out loud, but it's essentially a basic non-discrimination clause that your contractor will not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, or sex in performing their contract. So building your solicitation. What do you include in your RFQ? You want your intro and background to explain what the project is, what EPA grant is, and what exactly you're looking for. We already discussed what to include in the scope of work. A lot of what I'm saying is federally required regulations, so you want to make sure that you have explicit terms, conditions, and expectations that are aligned with that. You want to have a budget. You also want to have the consultant explain what their experience and qualifications are, what the submission requirements are, including its due date, and if there is an interview process, what the evaluation criteria will be for choosing the bid, what the project timetable will be as it relates to the work, and any attachments. Attachments will also include any local policies that have to do with conflicts of interest and any such disclosures. So evaluation criteria. Again, I've kind of covered this, but you have to include the evaluation criteria in the solicitation. It has to be weighted. As I mentioned prior, you want cost to be about 25% of the weighted criteria. Other things that you can consider in terms of choosing your bid is the experience capacity of the team, their experience with community engagement, the reasonableness of their price or cost proposal, their references, experiences in successfully completing past projects. Again, you can't preclude people who haven't, or companies rather, who haven't previously had worked on EPA grants, as that would limit open competition, but you can, in the evaluation criteria, favor those who have past experience, as well as experience in addressing contaminated properties. So the bid process, again, I kind of went over this. You want to make sure you have a minimum of 30 days on the website or other means to promote a full and open competition. This should include points of contact. You have to share your question and answers as well publicly from the consultants who may have questions and answers, such that in order to promote free and open competition, all people who are submitting an RFP or an RFQ are aware and everybody is working off the same basis of information. The bid process should also include, deadlines, and if you would like to conduct interviews, those as well. So the EPA doesn't require or encourage applicants to procure contractors or consultants before the EPA cooperative agreement is awarded, but you can choose to do so. If you do, you have to disclose that you have done so in your application. Let's talk about threshold criteria. In the threshold criteria, applicants have to describe the procurement procedures that were followed when they hired the contractors, and include information on when and where the RFP or the RFQ was posted, the length of time that it was advertised, the number of firms solicited, and the number of offers received and considered, as well as the names of the firms the applicants entered into contract with. In terms of FAQs, Can I do a single RFP for grant writing as well as implementation? You can, but it has to be a free and open competition. The RFP cannot be written by, taken from, or given by a consultant who might be bidding. That's legally required in the Uniform Grant Guidance. The evaluation must have cost criteria, and it has to adhere to all of the procurement guidelines and regulations. And again, cost reasonableness must be a factor on everything being solicited. Here are the resources. Again, we'll share this presentation afterwards. And I believe Fatima can also share these links in the chat as well. Overall, there are a lot of legal regulations, and so I would definitely encourage you to read CFR 200 and the Uniform Grant Guidance to make sure that you're in compliance. The main object is for a free and open competition, and so you do not want to give any one contractor an advantage or just a seeming advantage. And you have to document your processes, document. Everything related to the bidding process and everything related to soliciting RFP or RFQ proposals and statements of qualifications from disadvantaged business enterprises should be documented. And if you experience any hardships in that advertising process, you should also document those hardships. And now it's time for questions.
I'm going to interject one here, not through the chat. You touched on this briefly about procuring for both the grant writing services and the implementation. Mm-hmm. And that's been a common practice due to needing that expertise to write a competitive grant application that the locality may not have, or the nonprofit may not possess. How do you justify that in your narrative, your grant narrative? Have y'all, as you're reviewing, have you seen this come through, and how is that justified to meet EPA standards?
Yeah, completely understandable. I think in terms of, it doesn't necessarily need.
Here, I have a recommendation.
Yeah.
Because it's very common practice. I would even say maybe most communities tend to go that way, like doing the single procurement where you're getting the grant writing services as well. My recommendation in your narrative then for your application, keep it simple and just make a statement that you procured the consultant using, in compliance with the regulations. And I would leave it there. You don't really have to go into too much detail or provide the documentation in your application. I think if the EPA has any questions, that's something I'll follow up at a different time, but keep it simple, short, and sweet.
Yeah, I think the big legal ramification, again, not an attorney's daughter, but not an attorney, is that you have to make sure that if they wrote the grant for you, and then they would be the same firm that's doing the implementation, just that they're not writing the grant for you and then also writing an RFP or an RFQ for you, because then that would be illegal.
One of the common questions we get a lot at TAB is if we can share template RFPs for this sort of thing, or if we can share examples. And we can send you some examples of RFPs that, to the best of our knowledge, again, like, I don't know, just another caveat, kind of complies with all these different regulations that you can take a look at and model yours after. Never take a template from a consultant, but we can give you one. That's fine.
Right. thank you for that. Just wanted to clarify best practice.
Yeah, it does make it easier when you have, I shouldn't say this. I think communities do find it easier to do that one RFP and then procure a consultant to write the grant and then administer whatever work is going to be done once that is awarded. Just make sure that if that entity is writing your grant application, that you review it. Just because nobody knows your community better than you. And you can send it to us for a review as well.
Yeah, and as y'all touched on with writing the grant application, it's definitely a partnership between whether you have somebody in house writing that grant application or whether you have a consultant. You do still go through all of your community involvement, your site identification. It is still highly involved in writing that to make sure that they do understand your community and your project when submitting to EPA. And the folks that are on the call, the NJIT people are great, non-affiliated third party for reviewing documents, for providing documents, and I encourage folks to use this resource as provided by EPA for our region if you're considering moving forward in a grant application or with any type of cleanup work, assessment work. It's there, and it's a good checkbox for having somebody non-affiliated, non-involved in the actual work of the project to get documentation from. All right, thanks, guys.
I guess we can give it another minute, see if anyone has any questions that come through the chat or the Q&A box. If you'd like to ask us offline, Fatima has dropped a lot of resources and ways to contact us. My contact information is up on the screen. So you know where to find us.
And I'll say if you have any questions locally as far as resources that are available in the state, each of the folks on this call were probably forwarded the meeting invite from a council of governments or somebody who's employed there. That's a system that we're using with the South Carolina Brownfields Environmental Site Testing Program. It's through the COGS. There's a contact there. If you have questions about this presentation, about assessment opportunities, cleanup opportunities, other state resources, that's a great place to start, as well as the South Carolina Department of Environmental Services for state questions. But that's your local on the ground resources, the COG right now, Council of Governments that you received the meeting invite from. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. I know we've taken up a good bit of the morning and appreciate the NJIT folks coming down and for Department of Environmental Services helping with us to sponsor this. And we look forward to getting any questions. And thank you again for your willingness to put this together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.